Thank you so much for those remarkably kind words, Nancy. So I take it that for you, this is a do-over. And more importantly, Nancy, thank you for your leadership and that of your family and the ATCO Group as one of Alberta's great homegrown companies, for having created enormous wealth, opportunity, and jobs for Albertans and people all across Canada. Thank you for all that you do. Now, thank you as well, Your Honor. I was surprised to have my boss here. It makes me a little bit nervous. She can fire me at will anytime for any reason, so I better be on my best behavior here. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you to Chiefs Crowchild, Fox, and Morin for being here, to Mayor Nenshi, Your Worship, to all of the ministers and MLAs, and to all of you for a moment to talk about the future of our great province, our effort to renew Alberta as the beating heart of enterprise and opportunity, of economic progress across Canada. First of all, thanks again to, I should say that, thanks for the lovely lunch. I was hoping after the study that came out yesterday, it might be Alberta beef. I don't know if you saw this study, but it said, it gave the thumbs up to eating beef again, and that made our finance minister, rancher Travis Taze, very happy. I also note Sandip told me that this was the only venue they could get. Everything else is sold out. So I'd like to take that as a small sign of growth in Calgary, together with some of the recent real estate statistics. But thank you so much to the Calgary Chamber for the invitation. And I understand that tomorrow you'll be hosting the Canadian Global Cities Council, a Calgary-led coalition of the 8 largest metro chambers of commerce and boards of trade to discuss for the inaugural Natural Resources Summit that will focus on Canada's potential to lead in natural resource development and reducing carbon emissions. It will highlight Canadian resource industry leadership on environmental and social governance, ESG, and the transition to a lower carbon world. So I'd like to thank the Calgary Chamber for that, and as we also have Janet Riopel from the Edmonton Chamber here, I want to tell you, I was just speaking to the AGM of the Canadian Chamber in St. John a couple of weeks ago, and our Alberta crew brought hundreds of I Support Canadian Energy t-shirts, so thanks for your fashion sense. So I've been asked to talk about, to offer an economic update, and I can't do that without discussing the challenging years that we have been through. You all know this very well, that Alberta has been going on into our 5th year of economic, initially decline, and now years of stagnation. The size of our provincial economy today is smaller than it was in 2014. Per capita GDP and average after-tax family incomes are still down by about 5%. Business investment has fallen year after year, and as you know, tens of billions of dollars of capital, of investment, has fled our province. Over this time, over 100,000 jobs have been lost, and again, we've led the country in bankruptcies. And to be sober about this, we also know that we are facing headwinds in the global economy, with many worrying indications of a potential global recession, the dreaded inverted yield curve, declining demand in Europe and China, potential global trade disputes, all of which bode ill for global demand, including for the kind of commodities that we produce in Alberta. So these are indeed challenging times. But we Albertans are never faint of heart. We're the kind of people, as are those who went before us, who see in challenge an opportunity. And that's why I believe our government was elected with the largest ever Democratic mandate, the first government ever to receive over 1 million votes just 5 months ago, on an ambitious, bold, action-oriented, and specific mandate to renew Alberta's economy, to get it back on track, to create jobs, to restore investor confidence, and, as I say, once again, turn this province into the beating heart of enterprise. And it wasn't talk. It has been 5 months of rapid action. With the carbon tax elimination, we pause there to say that Not everybody agreed with this, although 2/3 of Albertans did. But we truly believed that the retail carbon tax was nothing but a pointless dead weight cost on the Alberta economy that punished people for living normal lives, for heating their homes and filling up their gas tanks, and for small businesses operating, charities, nonprofits, school boards, and municipalities with zero measurable gain for the environment. And so in eliminating that, we in one fell swoop delivered the single largest tax break in Alberta fiscal history. And then we passed the job creation tax cut, which over 4 years will reduce Alberta's tax rate on job creators, on employers, by 1/3 from 12 to 8%. We will have by far the lowest taxes on business in Canada. In fact, the next lowest province, Ontario, will be 45% higher than our business tax rate. And once fully implemented in 2021, our combined federal-provincial tax on employers will be lower than the combined state-federal rate in 44 of the 50 United States. And we're not necessarily, that's right, give that a round of applause. And this was in part necessary. You know, my opposition doesn't seem to grasp this, but while they were busy in government raising the business tax rate, our major competitor was busy slashing their taxes on employers. So we went from a significant tax advantage over the United States, with which we compete for job-creating investment, to a huge tax disadvantage. We need to reverse that. To stop that, you know, Ross Perot used to talk about the giant sucking sound of American jobs going to Mexico. Well, that giant sucking sound is capital and jobs moving from Alberta to the United States. Tens of billions of dollars and jobs and equipment and hopes and dreams that have moved from Alberta, largely from our energy sector, to the same sector in places like Texas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Colorado. You know it's true. And we're not going to get back in the game for the competition over that job-creating capital investment with good intentions and political speeches. It requires real action. And by the way, this has to be the heart of any strategy at economic diversification. It's to create the optimal overall macroeconomic conditions. So whatever sector people operate in, they will see Alberta as the best place in which to invest. Within days of becoming premier, I took this message to Bay Street, met with some of the CEOs of the Chartered 5 banks and said, tell your CFO to take out their calculator and calculate how much you can save by moving operations to Alberta from high-tax Ontario. And oh, by the way, did I tell you about the almost free AAA office space in downtown Calgary right now? And as Mayor Nenshi will be quick to add, the best quality of life in North America year after year. So we have a competitive advantage, but we have to amplify it through policies like this, as well as our red tape reduction strategy, which has been given a legislative framework with the appointment of a minister for red tape reduction, with the mandate to reduce by 1/3 the number of job-killing regulatory requirements imposed by Alberta's government. Because while we were patting ourselves on the back for being this great entrepreneurial province, the truth is that during the good years, there was a constant layering of regulatory complexity. We didn't really notice it as it happened incrementally. Nancy has spoken passionately about this, about the thousands of pages to get a simple regulatory approval from one of our regulatory agencies. But here's what happened. We ended up with being the most over-regulated and slowest moving economy in terms of regulations in Canada. According to the Federation of Independent Business, ours is the only province to get an F on its red tape burden. Next door in BC, they get an A on the red tape burden. And our regulatory agencies are often taking as much as 4 times longer to make decisions on comparable applications as in competing jurisdictions like Texas and Oklahoma. And that is why our goal is, over this term, to reduce by at least 1/3 the number of regulatory requirements and to speed up approvals We believe that to be at least as fast as any other jurisdiction in North America. And I know that this is possible without diminishing the independence of our regulatory agency and the high standards that they apply for environmental health and consumer safety. It's about applying a common sense, outcome-based regulatory approach rather than a process-obsessed approach. It's about allowing for omnibus applications for projects instead of forcing employers to go through endless consecutive applications. It's about ministries and agencies working together. This is also why we're engaged in a comprehensive governance and policy review of the Alberta Energy Regulator with an interim board to ensure that that agency is at least as efficient as its peer agencies in jurisdictions with which we compete. We've also brought in the Royalty Guarantee Act because people told us that the royalty reviews in 2008 and 15 spooked investors. And so this provides long-term, predictable, statutory certainty with the royalty regime in Alberta. We passed the Open for Business Act, which brought balance back to our labor legislation, restored workplace democracy, and undid the damaging 50% increase in the youth minimum wage, which resulted in Alberta having a youth employment crisis by bringing in the youth job creation wage as we've done. We've also given municipalities, through legislation, the ability to offer generous tax holidays for new capital investment. When I was in India last year talking to some major global companies, they said they were looking at petrochem, multi-billion-dollar capex for petrochem facilities in North America, and they were comparing us to Texas and Louisiana, unsurprisingly. And they talked to us about the incentives that those jurisdictions offered, one of which is property tax incentives. And that is why we listened to many of our municipalities by bringing in this tool into their toolkit. They don't have to use it, but if they want to bring in major new investment and they have to compete with similar jurisdictions, now they have the ability to do so. Another key part of our job creation strategy will be the Alberta Advantage Immigration strategy, which Minister Copping is consulting on right now. And I'll speak a little bit more about this later, but we want to use the power that the federal government has given us to select about 6,000 primary economic immigrants every year to choose people who are going to help us diversify this economy with proven entrepreneurial skills, people who are going to be job creators in Alberta. And we're going to focus that program increasingly outside of the two big cities. We've got enough people in Calgary and Edmonton, but our smaller communities are struggling with demographic stagnation, and in some cases decline. We want to help reboot those local economies through smart immigration policy. And we've done things like brought stability back to our power production markets by reverting to the energy-only power market, which Suncor says was one of the conditions that allowed them to proceed with their $1.5 billion cogen facility up in Wood Buffalo. That is a huge environmental and financial win. Will reduce by one quarter the carbon emissions at their base plant, reduce water and usage, improve air quality, and provide a domestic market for stranded Alberta natural gas. And I can tell you that there are a number of other proponents looking at similar investments in our electricity sector. And there is good, and we've done, a lot of what we've done has been kind of below the radar screen, very granular, tough files that we've worked on. For example, you know that our natural gas industry is facing real challenges. And that's why we provided retroactive property tax relief to our dry gas producers. We are also reviewing the assessment rules around dry gas wells, the linear property taxes. And I want to thank Russ Girling and TC Energy for cooperating with our Associate Minister for Natural Gas, Dale Lalli, and the vast majority, over 80% of producers, mid and downstream companies who agreed to going back to rules that allow for a more intelligent management of natural gas inventories during maintenance period in the summer to avoid negative prices, to give our gas producers a lifeline until we can get liquid LNG and other export opportunities. So much of this has happened, and I'm going to speak a bit more about the oil industry in a minute. But we see signs of hope. Despite some of the storm clouds on the global horizon, despite the 5 challenging years. We see housing starts up in Calgary. We see some major investments coming on. I mentioned Suncor last week. TELUS announced what I think may be the single largest investment announcement in Alberta economic history, $16 billion in digital infrastructure that will help to modernize and diversify our economy, including in underserved communities, including in Indigenous and remote communities. And there will be a series of announcements following in agritech and in healthcare and in helping us to deliver public services more efficiently, a $16 billion announcement over 5 years that will create at least 5,000 new good-paying jobs. Tomorrow, I'll be at Cavendish Farms in Lethbridge to open a $500 million new potato processing plant, which is part of a new generation of food processing and value added in our ag sector. And many more positive things to come. We're in discussions with consortia that are well advanced in considering major multi-billion-dollar investments in petrochemical petrochemical programs, for example, to take advantage of our low gas feedstock prices in Alberta. So all of that is good news, but you know as well as I do that unless and until we get market access for our largest commodity, which happens to be Canada's largest export product, our responsibly produced Alberta oil and gas, that our future remains challenging. That's why 2 weeks ago, I traveled to Wall Street, and I spent 3 days meeting with some of the largest funds, banks, market analysts, and financial institutions in the world. I met with folks representing institutions with over $9 trillion of assets, either directly or under management. And my takeaway was that while they have all participated in Alberta's prosperity in the past, and some of them are looking at new deals right now, that the 4 basic impediments they identified to future investment in Alberta were the following. The general underperformance of energy stocks, and I think that's largely driven by the underwhelming results from the shale developments in the United States. We can't control that. Secondly, and I'm not kidding, the prospective re-election of Mr. Trudeau's government. The third primary concern revolved around ESG, environmental and social governance, and the fact that people are not hearing the current data and our real story about our huge improvements on environmental performance, and nor are they looking properly at the social context. I'll get to that. And fourthly, concerns around curtailment, which I see as just being the flip side of the coin of the lack of market access and pipelines. So let me speak to that last point, because we do control that. Now, first of all, I and our government could not be more market-oriented. We did in opposition support the imposition of curtailment last December. We did so because we were giving away Alberta oil at $10 a barrel with a $45 price differential, and we were looking at a zero on capital investment this year with a bunch of bankruptcies in our sector, and the Alberta taxpayer that owns the resource was getting nothing for it. We thought that was an intolerable situation, and we saw that in the development of Alberta's energy system in the 40s, 50s, and right up until the OPEC crisis, there actually was the use of regulatory tools to keep production roughly in line with egress, as happens in most other countries. And so we supported curtailment. When it was brought in, it was limiting production at 3.76 million barrels per day. Thanks to Minister Savage's prudent increases, we're now up to 3.79, and by December, we'll be up to 3.81 million barrels per day. So we're actually above where we curtailed last year, and we are making good progress in our discussions with upstream companies about a potential exemption for incremental barrels that are moved by rail if we can find a satisfactory conclusion to privatizing the rail contracts that were signed by the previous government. We do not believe that the government of Alberta should be operating as a rail company or as a midstream oil company. We do not believe that risk should fall on taxpayers. It belongs to the private sector. And I would point out that since those contracts were signed, the volume of crude shipped by rail has gone up from roughly 120,000 to over 300,000 barrels per day, with the market acting as it should under the right conditions. So if we can unencumber ourselves of those contracts, we should be in a position to offer special production allowances for incremental crude shipped by rail, which could increase rail shipments by as much as 250,000 barrels a day. And if our friends in our excellent pipeline companies continue to make technical progress through pipeline optimization, then we hope there will be another 100 or 1,000 or so barrels per day added. We obviously hope very much for the Line 3 replacement project with Enbridge, and that's one of the reasons I was recently in the United States. So I think we see a path forward to additional shipments of Alberta energy by hundreds of thousands of barrels a day until we get another major pipeline built. And on that, to come back to the environmental and social governance question, it is essential, and this is the view of our government is that for too long, we looked at the challenges around pipelines tactically, kind of with blinkers on. And we didn't realize that whether it's the litigation or the political campaign or the civil disobedience against TMX, that it's much the same kind of campaign that's been run against Keystone XL, or the political effort right now to shut down Line 5, which fuels much of southern Ontario and the upper Midwest of the United States. These were essentially the same political forces that got people elected to the federal government that immediately canceled the approved Northern Gateway pipeline, and that brought in absurd new regulatory requirements that in part precipitated the end of the Energy East project after $1 billion investment by TC Energy, and with it losing the dream of future energy independence for Canada. These things are all interconnected. Those are the same folks who lobbied for, and as staff in the Trudeau government, got the adoption of the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69, the prejudicial ban on Alberta bitumen exports off the North Coast. By the way, I believe that is the first time in Canadian economic history that the federal parliament has banned the export of one product produced in one province, in this case, Alberta bitumen. I want to thank a number of our chiefs here from our First Nations for having spoken up against these bills that were done without First Nations consultation, limiting their opportunity at future prosperity. And give them a hand for that. So, given how coordinated that campaign has been, we think it's necessary to address it. That is why we have articulated what we call a fight-back strategy. It's why we've appointed prominent Calgary business leader Steve Allen to lead a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act to dig into the bottom of the foreign-funded campaign to landlock Canadian energy. It's why we will be opening in a few short weeks the Alberta Energy Information Centre, this clearinghouse of information to respond in real time to all of the lies and myths told about our industry through paid, earned, and social media. Why we'll be setting up satellite offices in key markets to inform opinion leaders and media across North America and around the world. It's why we're making clear to companies like HSBC that if they unfairly boycott Alberta while continuing to finance OPEC producers, that Alberta will boycott them. It's why we are creating the Indigenous, and have launched the Indigenous Defense Fund, to provide financial backing to First Nations who believe they need to go to court to defend their right to prosperity, their economic rights. This is to level the playing field. This is to level the playing field, because for too long, a small number of groups have gotten almost all of the political and legal voice share, while the vast majority of Western Canadian First Nations, who want to be partners in prosperity, who want the right to move their people from poverty to prosperity, through partnerships and resources. They deserve to be consulted by the Crown before things like Northern Gateway are shut down and C-48 are imposed on them. They deserve to have at least an equal legal footing, and so we've launched the Indigenous Defence Fund. It's also why we're challenging Bill C-69 as being an unconstitutional violation of our exclusive authority to regulate our energy, and so much more that we are doing. Now, having said all of that, we need to persuade our fellow Canadians in the 3 weeks that's left in this federal election that the economic crisis in Alberta is a huge national issue. As Professor Toom published yesterday with the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, the data which demonstrates how the Alberta downturn and stagnation has massively affected national prosperity. He estimates that if our economy had continued post-2014 to grow at the same level as British Columbia's, that our national GDP would be 2.6% higher. That's $130 billion a year. If that had happened, our national deficit would be $13 billion smaller than it is. The deficit would be cut in half at the federal level. So this means thousands of dollars in the pockets of families from Newfoundland to British Columbia. And what's happening in this province, in the long run, jeopardizes our ability to be the great generator of wealth for the rest of the country. You know that we still contribute net $20 billion a year to the rest of the Federation, $610 billion net fiscal contribution to the rest of Canada since the late 1950s. That means that schools and hospitals have been built in Ontario and Quebec. Roads have been paved in Newfoundland and Manitoba. Jobs have been created. Healthcare has been provided. Education has been subsidized, thanks in large part to the wealth generated in this province. Now, so we need to persuade our fellow Canadians that what is happening here in Alberta matters at kitchen tables and in public services from coast to coast. And let me segue then, I'm getting short on time, but I've got one last thing I got to say here in the context of this federal election. We Albertans have been nation builders. You know, I'm getting tired of reading Globe and Mail and Toronto Star editorials snarkily criticizing these parochial Albertans who keep talking about the economic challenges that we are going through. The truth is this. Alberta has been the beating heart of Canadian prosperity for recent decades. Through equalization and other transfers, we have helped to lift people up, our fellow Canadians, and we are proud to have done so. We are proud to have shared much of our good fortune with our fellow Canadians when times were good here and bad elsewhere. And we are proud to be able to continue doing that, hopefully, in the future. We are not little Canadians. We are big Canadians. You know how we can demonstrate that? Alberta, under our government's leadership, has become the national leaders in promoting the economic union of Canada, which was the original vision of Confederation in 1867. Since we've come to office, our government has moved from 27 Alberta exceptions under the Canada Free Trade Agreement to only 6, with the average across the country is, I think, 22. So we have by far now the lowest number of exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. We're studying the elimination of 2 others. We're also studying the prospect, like, and I say study, I mean like looking very aggressively at unilateral recognition of professional and trade certification from all across Canada. It should not be easier to move as a doctor or a nurse from Bulgaria and Portugal than it is between Manitoba and Alberta. We Albertans believe in free trade. We believe in the economic union. And I am no longer going to sit around waiting for politicians to haggle about this. We are acting to create the prosperity to recover the $130 billion a year that we lose in this country because of interprovincial trade barriers. And we call upon the federal government and the federal parties to join us in ambition to create an economic union in Canada. In fact, I would welcome an economic charter of rights, which gives Canadians the right to move to and have their credentials recognized in other provinces to trade freely between provinces. And another thing about how Albertans are truly big Canadians, and I would call us constitutional federalists. We actually understand in our political culture the Canadian Constitution. So, for example, we now have three major federal leaders, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh, and Ms. May, all of whom are essentially saying that provinces can, through their own volition, create barriers to interprovincial projects like pipelines. All of them have said that we can balkanize Canada between 10 different jurisdictions, violating the letter of the Constitution. Section 9210A of the 1867 Constitution makes it clear that provinces do not have jurisdiction on, quotes, works and undertakings connecting the province with any other or others of the provinces or extending beyond the limits of the province. And that is backed up by Section 9210C, which allows the federal parliament for greater certainty to declare projects even within just one province to be for the national general advantage, which Senator Doug Black tried to get passed through Parliament. Unfortunately, was voted down by this Liberal government. So here we have Mr. Trudeau, who has given a de facto veto to Quebec over interprovincial pipelines, who did nothing to enforce the letter of the Constitution against threats by British Columbia's NDP government to obstruct Trans Mountain. We have Mr. Singh and May being even more enthusiastic about this. What we Albertans are saying, as champions of national unity, as passionate Canadians, is respect the vision of the Federation. Do not balkanize this country and in so doing diminish our prosperity. Free trade and the economic union also implies the ability to build big projects from coast to coast, like the railway that united this country in the first place. And so we call on these leaders. And by the way, let me say this. At the Council of the Federation, we got 12 of the 13 premiers to sign on to language agreeing with resource corridors and energy corridors across the country, including specific mention of oil and gas pipelines. So what a strange world that we live in, where we've got 12 of the 13 provinces welcoming energy corridors, but 3 of the 4 federal leaders opposing them. I want to thank my friend Andrew Scheer for championing this idea of resource corridors. And again, let me say that we are champions of this nation-building principle of the economic union. Absolutely. Just as we are constitutional federalists and support the exclusive authority of provinces, for example, to develop our own resources. Peter Lougheed fought and won this important battle at the time of patriation, 1981, when he secured Section 92A1 of the Constitution, which reads, in each province, the legislature may exclusively make laws in relation to exploration for non-renewable natural resources in the province and development, conservation, and management of non-renewable natural resources in the province, including laws in relation to the primary production therefrom. Perhaps the most important constitutional battle won by Alberta in the history of the Federation. And yet, Mr. Trudeau's government just passed Bill C-69, just brought it into law 3 weeks ago, which is an obvious prima facie violation of our exclusive provincial jurisdiction to govern the development of our resources. And so here we have a federal government which refuses to respect the Constitution, calling for nation-building projects like national infrastructure in violation of the Constitution, while at the same time violating the Constitution and its exclusive authority for provinces to regulate their own resources. I'm sorry, Mr. Trudeau. We Albertans are champions of the Canadian Constitution and national unity, and we call upon all federal leaders to respect the Canadian Constitution and the vision of unity included in it. So I'll just close by saying, and this comes back to the economic question. We're not going to get this economy firing on all cylinders if this country balkanizes itself and if we do not get market access for our responsibly produced energy. So we Albertans are true federalists. We believe in a big Canada. We respect the original, not just intent, but language of the Constitution. And we reject the parochial vision of federal parties who are undermining the economic union and balkanizing this country at the worst possible time. So let us, as Albertans, send with passion our message to our fellow Canadians from coast to coast. We are proud to have shared prosperity with people across the country. We are proud to have offered good jobs to people who needed to move here from unemployment to the dignity of work in this province. We want to continue playing that role. All we need is a federal government that respects the vision of an economic union that we had at the beginning of this federation. I hope Canadians will embrace that vision. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
That conversation. First of all, I'm 2 for 2.
Are you on?
I don't know if I'm on, but
There we are.
yeah, there we go. I'm 2 for 2. First of all, there was 2 bets in the office. One, we're going to get only a few questions, so thank you for that. Second, there'd probably be a standing ovation.
Okay.
So there we go.
Can you guys hear us at the back?
No?
Is that better?
We're good now. There we go.
All right.
Yeah.
I kind of blew out the timeline there.
I know.
Can we have somebody move this podium out of the way so folks can see me over here? Is that possible? Because I feel like, all right.
All right.
Over to you, Sam.
So that's okay. Well, I mean, it was 2 bad jokes, so there we go. That's all anybody ever missed. So, but on the plus side, I just said I won 2 bets, so that's where we are. No, and so again, there's question cards on your tables. There's a phone number.
I know
there
people
for
have
you
to go back to work, but I'm happy. I love
Yeah.
answering questions, so I'll let her rip. Okay.
Yeah. No, we got to make the economy grow, so they got to go back. So one question I wanted to start out with was around the tier program. You didn't talk about that, but I know that you've been doing some consultation. So can you provide us with an update on the
Sure.
tier program and how that bridges towards a lower carbon economy?
The tier program is our practical alternative to the punishing carbon tax. It is the Technology, Innovation, and Environmental Research Fund that will be, this was in our platform, it will be supported by a levy on major industrial emitters, any plant that produces over 100,000 tons of CO2 per annum, which would equal about 55% of Alberta employers will be affected by the tier fund. We, in the platform, committed to a $20 price, but we want to make sure that we are in sync with whoever's in the federal government so that we can maintain, we can protect our regulatory authority. So we are open, as I said to Prime Minister Trudeau the day after we were elected, to going to the federal price point of $30. We are in consultations. Minister Nixon and Minister Savage are leading those consultations, and we'll be making an announcement about the design of the tier levy and fund in the last week of October, shortly after the budget. It will require firms to either reduce emissions, buy credits, or pay into the tier levy to meet a 10% reduction target below 2015 to 2017 levels, or for the best performing facilities, it will meet a high performance, they must meet a high performance benchmark. And so it incorporates, I think, some of the best features of both the CCIR system under the last government and the ESCR system under the previous PC government. The first $100 million of revenue generated will go into the tier fund to support research and development of technology to reduce GHG output and improve environmental performance, plus 50% of any incremental revenues over $100 million.
Okay. One of the questions that's come in is about the fact that the Canadian energy system, narrative and conversation that you've been having doesn't seem to be reaching the general population. Still, they don't trust the oil and gas industry. How do you plan on addressing this further?
Yeah, well, that comes back to the ESG concerns I heard expressed on Wall Street 2 weeks ago, which we take very seriously. Our government is setting up a ESG working group with the Canadian energy industry to work in tandem with our Energy Information Center, which we've been calling the War Room, which will be our clearinghouse for information. That will help to inform advertising, both general public advertising, but also very targeted towards opinion leaders. What I have discovered in Wall Street and elsewhere is that many opinion leaders are operating on a pretty dated and vague and often distorted picture of our environmental performance here. They do not know that we have a measurable reduction of 19% in GHG or carbon intensity for a barrel of Alberta oil over the past decade alone. By some measurements, a 29% reduction since the year 2000. Or that we're on the cusp of a revolutionary application of technologies that will reduce water usage and energy consumption, and therefore GHG emissions, by moving from steam to, for example, solvents for SAGD projects, for bitumen projects. So and they don't know about the conversion, for example, what Suncor just did with new technology on the gas cogen facilities. So I really, and I also believe that while people have derided carbon capture and storage in the past, there is increasing evidence that this technology works, that the cost of it is coming down so it can be scalable at an industrial scale, and it can have the great advantage of helping with enhanced oil recovery. So, I mean, I could go on and on. You know about some of the innovations happening out of our universities, and the Tier Fund will help to accelerate some of this. We have a great story to tell. But look, it can't, we're playing the other side's game if we limit the conversation only to GHGs, which are important. But what about other environmental issues? Conservation, air quality, water quality. Do you really think that our standards are lower than in OPEC or Russia, or for that matter, the United States? And the ESG, why doesn't anybody ever talk about the S, the social metrics? You know, and I made this point on Wall Street. We want to work with like-minded stakeholders to develop a credible, fact-based alternative ESG matrix, which includes real metrics for social. Mm-hmm. Because if you measure us to any of the OPEC dictatorships, or Russia, or any of the other major energy producers, on our treatment of human rights, of women's rights, of indigenous rights, of labor rights, of social outcomes, we knock their lights out. And I refuse to allow us to be lectured to by European banks and insurance companies who are zero rating the Alberta oil sands on ESG while they are financing and backstopping the OPEC dictatorships. We're going to take that right to their doorsteps in Europe.
So I'd concur with some of those comments around the fact that it's hard to get the acknowledgement for the efforts that have already been made. And so part of the and conversation is to get those acknowledgements and working collectively. One of the questions is around improving access and adoption around climate change across the section of multiple industries around technology and innovation. So the provincial government is going to release a budget that's going to talk about the Alberta Investor Tax Credit, the Capital Investor Tax Credit, which is needed capital to infuse these kinds of technologies, right? And so what can we expect from the budget with respect to the Alberta Investor Tax Credit, and how does that propel us to get further acknowledgement on our technology and innovation that we're infusing into our asset-based industries?
Well, thank you. So first of all, I think we agree on the need to continue pushing forward the innovation agenda, and I've just talked about that this will be supported by the Tier Fund. With respect to the Alberta Investor Tax Credit, Sandip, I'm frankly a bit skeptical with the notion that it will fuel some of these huge future changes in environmental outcomes on an industrial scale, because you're talking there largely about startups, relatively small. And I mean, so it's no secret that we have that, and all tax credits under review as we go into a very challenging budget. You've all, I'm sure, seen elements of Dr. Janice McKinnon's report, who she underscores that we are overspending by about $10 billion a year. If we were spending the same per capita level as our peer provinces, we'd be spending $10 billion less. We'd have a $3 billion surplus instead of the $7 billion deficit that we have. So we have to control our spending. That it has to include tax expenditures. And see, Sandip, our alternative here is to create the best macroeconomic conditions. The 1/3 reduction in the corporate income tax rate is orders of magnitude more powerful than any boutique tax credit. I mean, we have out of the AITC, we haven't, to be clear, we have not made final decisions on it, but on the AITC, I think we have 150 companies have benefited from it. But 100,000 companies will benefit from the job creation tax cut to the general business rate. Under the AITC, I think that the tax expenditure this year, Travis, is in the range of $20 million, as opposed to what we think will be a net tax expenditure of about $900 million on the job creation tax cut. So I would say that, you know, to folks who want boutique tax credits, I understand there's always an argument for them. But we've bought into the idea that we should not be a dirigiste government picking winners and losers or microsectors. We should create the right overall conditions. Another thing about the AITC is it's application-based. So you need bureaucrats to review the applications, that's slow-moving, whereas a general tax cut benefits everybody automatically on their tax forms. So we're open to some kinds of tax assistance for innovation, don't get me wrong, but we want to make sure that it's a light touch, it's efficient, and that overall the bigger tax cut gets the job done.
Okay. One last question here. How can Alberta communicate to the public that we're taking action with regards to climate change concerns, as that's been a large part of the conversation through the election, but also with the marches across the country and around the globe?
Well, I think I've gone through some of the data on that already.
How do we get the hearts?
Well, you know, maybe we need to put up billboards in the tube stations in London pointing out how certain companies are, you know, with a picture of Canada next to a picture of Saudi Arabia and how people are treated there. I think we get their hearts by focusing on the social dimension. How do you get to people's hearts? By talking about people. And it is outrageous that we have allowed the tar sands campaign, funded largely by US foundations, to defame this liberal democracy with the highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards on earth, while doing precisely nothing to impair the energy industries in countries that treat women like property instead of people. You know, and while these major institutional investors continue to write checks, I mean, we had one French company, I won't mention a name, that moved capital out of the Alberta oil sands and then 3 months later invested in gas fields in Iran, where gay men are hanged. You want to get to people's hearts? I think, first of all, you can't only have a discourse on the environment that is an emotional one. You also need to appeal to reason. People who do not accept that we cannot transition off of hydrocarbon energy, like if they believe as a matter of religious faith that could be done tomorrow, then there's no persuading. But for the rational central cohort of public opinion in developed democracies, I think we need to point out the stark difference between Canada as a major source of energy and those dictatorships. And I can tell you, when I was in New York, this point hit home. on the security side because I was there just 24 hours after the Saudi Aramco drone strikes. And it suddenly brought home to the folks with whom I was meeting that reliability and security, which is ultimately a result of our political values, is an essential part to a gradual transition in energy markets. So I think we've got a great, not just a great story, I think we've got the best story to tell. And at least with this government, we're going to start to tell it with every bit of energy that we have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So thank you for the conversation today and for developing business forward environment. I completely concur the macro has a lot to do with how people see and view us in a global stage.